All right, so this is Chapter 9, Section 3, Solving Quadratic Equations. So before we were graphing quadratic equations, and now we're going to start to solve quadratic equations. So we're going to solve in two different ways in this lesson. We're going to solve quadratic equations by graphing and by using square roots. All right, so just to remind you, the standard form of a quadratic equation is a little bit different. Last time we had y equals, or f of x equals. This time we have our ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And our goal here is to solve for x. So our first method, by graphing, is to graph and find the x-intercepts. And I'm going to use a graphing calculator to help me with this today. So the first equation I have is x squared minus 16 equals 0. So I'm going to graph y equals right pen color here. I'm going to graph y equals x squared minus 16 and see where that graph equals 0. So if I go to my decimals graphing calculator and I graph y equals x squared minus 16, I want to take a look at this equation, take a look at the graph, and I want to find where my line crosses the x-axis. Where it crosses the x-axis is going to be my zeros. So at x equals -4 and at x equals +4. So my answers, according to my graph, so if I were to answer this, I would make a little graph on my paper. And sketch the graph just to show that I didn't just look the answers up. And at -4 and +4. So the solutions to this are x equals -4 and x equals +4. Okay, so let's see another example of that. 3x squared plus 6 equals 0. We'll go here. 3x squared plus 6. I'm going to have y equals, oh, this is a tricky one. Take a look at this graph here. It does not at all, here's my x-axis, wait, right down here. This equation, this graph, this parabola, does not cross the x-axis anywhere. So I am going to have to say that this has no solutions. All right. And then if you're showing your work, you want to make sure you include, if we're using graphing, you have to include a graph in your work to show that you actually graphed it, and that's where you got no solution. Just writing down the answer is not enough. You always have to show your work. All right. So one thing I would like to highlight is that we call solutions, there's several different names that solutions can go by. They can go by roots, they can go by zeros, they can go by x-intercepts, and all of them mean the same thing. So if I say solution, or if I say roots, or if I say zeros, or if I say x-intercepts, they all mean the same thing. It's all where x is equal, where y is equal to 0. All right, so method 2 is we're going to use square roots. And an example of that is if I have x squared equals 64, and I were to take the square root of both sides. So if I take the square root of x squared, I would get x. And if I were to take the square root of 64, well, unfortunately, there are two numbers that when I multiply them by itself will give me 64. There's positive 8 and negative 8. Both of those are valid answers. So when you take the square root of both sides, you have to account for positive and a negative answer that you're going to get. All right, so let's look at that here for this problem. So the first thing I want to do is, in order to get square roots, I need your squared on one side and everything else on the other. So in this case, I'm going to have to add 36 to both sides to get my square where it needs to be, all by itself on one side. So this is actually m squared equals 36. And like we saw before, when I take the square root of both sides, I have to say that the answer is going to be plus and minus 6. Both of these answers are correct. All right, so let's look at this problem where we have 3x squared plus 15 equals 0. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 15 from both sides. And then divide by 3. So now I have x squared all by itself over here, and negative 5 all by itself over here. So I want to take the square root of both sides. So we're going to square root, and x is equal to, okay, we have a big issue here because this would be, if 5 were positive, I could take the square root, but if you look at your calculator, if I had a negative 5 and I tried to take the square root of that, it says invalid input because you can't take the square root of a negative number. So we have to say this is a no solution case. Remember when we did the graph and it didn't cross the x-axis? That's the type of scenario we have here. All right, last problem. So I want to solve for d squared here, so I'm going to subtract 16 from both sides. We have 4d squared equals 0. I'm going to divide by 4. I get d squared equals 0, square root of both sides. And d equals 0. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. And that's how you use roots to solve quadratics.